Okay, today we're going to talk about a few things that make connections here. Most of you probably recognize the image on the left as being the Egyptian God Seth. This is on the cover of a book by David Litwa. He's an Australian researcher and author, and he's made a few books now and working on another. And this one is showing you something that's rarely, if ever, talked about. But if you'll remember, about a year and a half ago, or a little more than a year ago, I went way back to the earliest Egyptian dynasties and started talking about them and how it came in and how they seem to have interwoven the first dynasties into the idea of Horus and Isis and so on. But they had already had Hathor before that point and other points, which those gods got in step to, and it was a conglomeration situation, but you could tell that was also a mending of two people. It wasn't just one. It was the Badarians and the Nakata culture that were coming together, and there was a third implement that I've always insinuated, and others have too, about the Sumerians. But also, we find now through archaeology that was a very similar culture that came and bled down into theirs, the Natufians, and that gives a different look too. But well, we're going to make connections with the people out of the Bible and kind of specifically harping on the Old Testament, but the whole idea itself in a connection to these ancient gods here. You see, because Set, who I showed was Set Peribsen, that's the second dynasty ever of Egypt whenever they had come together. And I have this firm belief, along with other Egyptologists and researchers, that whenever they ended the first dynasty and it folded, the other people were able to take a shot at it. And so this was kind of a yin and yang situation. In fact, that's how they interplayed it into the situation that we hear about in the book of the Coming Forth by Day or the Book of the Dead, or there are actually daily rituals where Ra takes the boat with Horus around the world and goes to the underworld and comes back up. Well, if you've ever looked into it, they say that they have to have Set because, well, of one reason, Set's the only one that can withstand the hypnotic gaze of Apep the snake to be able to get back around and out. He knows the secret. He has the magic. You know, it's kind of a special thing. Each one has characteristics, and they make it all work. It's much later, really around 200 BC, that Seth starts looking at as being a god of chaos and evil. Well, then you'd have to say the Egyptians were worshiping evil. Well, no, it doesn't really go that way. It's kind of just like the lioness deity that they tell the story about, where she went crazy killing people off and making the desert, and they had to feed her red colored beer which looked like blood, so she drank it and then calmed down. It's just a parable type story, but it's also one of those ideas where it's kind of telling you, well, how the snake lost its legs, or how this desert formed out here in a mythological way. And nowadays we see something like that, we can easily see that that's a mythological story. This book by David Litwa here is about Seth, and it's called The Evil Creator. And he says that it has to do with the very first of an ideal that people finally get to take a look at what the God of the Old Testament looked like. And it's kind of a strange story, and it's not just one telling, for there are quite a few, most of which are before the time of Christ even, and back in the time of the, well, I guess what would be the end of the Old Testament, and then those gaps of a few hundred years in between there and when the New Testament was written. You see, there was like 4 wars that happened during that time, well, not 3, during the time that I'm trying to encompass right here. And basically between just after 0 AD coming up to about 135 AD. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So there's been a lot of comments on what Seth even is. It's a strange looking creature. It doesn't quite look right. The Egyptians do pretty good anthropomorphic statues. Why don't they have something that looks a little more correct, like a donkey? People have even tried to say this is an aardvark. Things like that. I've been duped into repeating that too. This is more like a donkey. But they formed his face in a way that he can speak. You see, because this is a talking donkey as well as that's a talking bird. And you've heard birds talk back before, but you haven't heard other creatures do it. Whenever we use that in any type of old mythology, you can easily tell that's a fairy tale. Well, there's a talking donkey in the Bible too. And in fact, that is something that is actually showing you connection hidden in their stories. Before the Hyksos came down and into Egypt, there were no horses in Egypt. There weren't any chariots. They say the wheel doesn't exist or wasn't utilized in that correct way. But also in that same thing, they really couldn't in the sand use something like that too well. Amazingly, what they used instead, if you'll look at their art that we found, and what gives us a hint, is a sled. And as a human that's been through existence and a few winters here, a sled's something that Santa Claus gets into, and big sleds, and yeah, that works in snow and stuff real good, but sand kind of works that way too, and kind of shows you where these people may have gotten an idea of when to move stuff and so on too. Back in elder times, maybe brought through, but let's get back to Seth here. As I said, this has a connection to Set Peribsen. But also, if you've checked into the Bible, everybody knows about Cain and Abel and all of that. And the woman grows from a rib and eats from a magic tree because a talking snake told her to. There's another talking creature right there at the first of it. And people are like, boy, and what's next? But when Cain slays Abel, he ends up going banished to the land of Nod, which is already somehow named, and it's east of Eden. And it's also... or to the east in Eden, there's a garden and so on. And I've shown you that the reason that they chose certain angles is because of the way that the river and the land lays out naturally, or it's also written in the stars. It's the thing to the right of that, and with you staring this way, that's east. And so that's why they were sure that they went to the east, or had come from the east. Well, some of those times, this isn't something written in the stars. That's where they used to live. Here's where they live now. So it's not all written in the stars. It's not all BS either, actually. But once Cain slays Abel, then there's this conspicuous part that doesn't get mentioned too much, where Adam and Eve have another child named Seth. Now, in my other video about this, I turned around and showed you how Seth gets conflagrated later into the idea of Typhon by being Greekified and so on, or Hellenized, or whichever way you want to look at it. But he's known as a redhead there too, and whenever they show you some of the art that I showed you in that other video of Set Peribsen, he's always got red hair. In fact, there are depictions that are exactly like this, made out of granite, and where you see what would be his cowling that's on him, it's been soaked in red ochre. In fact, Seti, it means beloved by Seth. There's an area of a graveyard that they have there, the necropolis. And what's strange is BYU has been there for 25 years or more doing excavations, and they find out in this one area they're all redheads. In this other area they're all blonde. So it's almost like you wouldn't be together with your family because there are mixtures and so what, but back then maybe they kept it a little stricter than that. It's kind of strange, but that area is known as beloved by Seth, and that's what Seti means also. And so even though we're talking about the very start of it, there's Ginger, the pre-dynastic blonde strawberry red-headed Ghibelline mummy that comes from the Nakata II culture that's also a redhead, got his slightly curly hair there, and you can still find him in the British Museum. So these people were there before and led into these dynasties that go along with redheads. Well, if you look at it, there's also David was a redhead, and all these other people, Esau, so on, that are known as redheads. Of course, there's also a connection of twins and sacred twins and things like that, and also Greek tales woven in the Bible and all kinds of other things. It's what makes it such an amazing book, that it's put through and at least somewhat coherent. But when you read the Bible, there's all kinds of weird things that go on, and I'm about to tell you a weird thing here that David Litwa put together. For I had seen something like this before, and I told you when we were talking about Set Peribsen that there was another layer to that onion, and I'd have to track back down the literature. Well, in finding him here discussing this on this podcast, he actually shows, yeah, this is the ones that I was talking about. In fact, here's another one, and they make a few connections there, but I want to make a few more. So we're all familiar with this idea that's here, but there's a telling of Tacitus. And Tacitus said that when the Egyptians were wandering in the desert after they had left, oh man, I'm about to go off onto Exodus. Let me try to stay the ground just to get through this point, and then we'll go there. Whenever they had had their exodus and run away, Moses tells them to don't worship the gods that they had been worshiping or whatever, to just totally leave that idea out. And that what they would worship eventually would be the first thing that saved them, the God that would be saving them. Now this ends up happening at Sinai, and I've got other videos about who that probably and was at Mount Sinai, as opposed to who we're led to think it is. If you read through the Bible and check through, it's pretty simple. If it looks like they're worshiping Yahweh, and then Yahweh shows up and says, you aren't worshiping me, then you've got to be like, what? And then they stray and they're worshiping another God. But if you look into it more, okay, you got to try to figure out, okay, so which one is the Yahweh? And it never trails out right till you figure out which one it is. It's not really any of them, actually, because it always seems to falter one way or another, and they end up Baal worshiping or Asherah or all kinds of things. Volcano worshiping, because that's what that following a pillar by day and night has to go with. And also the cosmos itself, where at nighttime it looks like it's a pillar of smoke. But so what are they going to worship? What's the first thing that their savior? Well, supposedly in the story here, with these millions that leave Egypt, which actually other people have looked into it, and they say, you know, by the time that they would have gotten to their destination, there would be people still leaving Egypt if they were just like 3 or 4 abreast of each other walking out in single file like an army. It would take that, it would be that long of a snake of people. So it's a gross exaggeration in a way, and also a conflagration of the story that's not quite right. See if I can get through this. So they start running out of water instantly, running out here in the desert, and the first thing they find is a group of donkeys that end up leading him to water that comes across as being something like they found a stream, or when Moses hits a rock and the water comes out of it. And so now they're worshiping a donkey god. Try to say that three times fast. So it's kind of strange, but here we have this Seth too. Well, there's an idea that whenever the people that we call the people of the Bible leaving in Exodus and came out of it, others have turned around and said in this same ideal that what they did, seemingly out of spite, was to worship the exact opposite, to flip everything backwards. Kind of looking like it's just out of spite, but in reality what that would mean is that instead of being for Horus, you would be for Seth. You would be for chaos and things like that and disorder. Your God would be about that. In fact, what you'd be doing is constantly holding him back. But then there's also that stubborn entity that goes along with the ass and all these other concepts that fall into that aren't really necessarily traits of Set Peribsen in any way, shape, or form. But, over time, things get screwed up. Well, this is from about 200, 250 BC on through the time of Christ, all the way up to between 300 and 400 AD. So Tacitus says that these people ended up worshiping donkeys because of that. This is kind of like a Josephus thing, but it's a different form of literature. But then there's others of this too. So there's this tale of Antiochus that the guy talked about whenever they had destroyed the big temple that was there. Well, at this time it was a very small temple. It wasn't near what people think that it ever was, which it really never was. What we look at today is in part a Roman fort that was built. In fact, we'll get to the idea of something that most people don't know about who was where at this time too, and you don't think about things on that line. But at this point here, whenever they destroyed the temple and everything, this man walked into the priesthood area and took them all out, went in to make sure everybody's all gone, went back into the Holy of Holies apparently to make sure nobody was hiding back there or anything. And when he did, which was supposed to be empty, their God has no iconography or image at all, he said that there was a man statue, but the man had a donkey head. So this would be Seth of the ancient Egyptians, which really isn't touted very much. But if you look into the Hyksos, let's see if I can go there and come back real quick. If you look into the Hyksos and their idea, where they came into Egypt and infiltrated it pretty much, and then whenever Egypt had a hiccup, they just took over. And we're running at least half of it, so Egypt was no longer in its heyday thing again. And of course, before this, they were running along pretty good, and there's New Kingdom and so on. But at this point that the Hyksos come in, they stay for some 400 years, and that's what's all touted in the Bible or anything. People found out now, yeah, it's really 430 years, and somebody said it's 432 years exactly. And that's a sacred geometry number too, so all of a sudden hearing that, I was like, man, I thought we were getting real accurate, and then all of a sudden it comes across as a sacred number, but maybe that has more to do with truth than falsehood. But let's go farther with this idea. You see, because the whole idea of them going across the Red Sea, it's got to be the most impressive thing that happens in the Bible, other than the fact that the man just sneezes and creates the universe by words, like it's some magic abracadabra. But this parting of the Red Sea to let them walk across, if you'll read this in ancient Hebrew, you can go to BibleHub.com, you can click on Hebrew, and it'll actually show you the Hebrew and the way that it's written, the phonetic sounds of it below it, but then below it is transcribed out of Strong's Concordance. And if you go to this exact point here, they don't actually ever say that he went across the Red Sea. They say he went across the Sea of Reeds. And if you look into that, I wish I pulled up a picture right now for it, but the Sea of Reeds is across the delta and doesn't even have to involve the Red Sea. It's the Sea of Reeds. And that's where the Hyksos went across. So what invariably happened here is that whenever they got across, they got this spiteful idea, turned themselves into a donkey god worshipping people, which is going to be verified again by 3 others here, by the way, other than Tacitus we just spoke of. But in that idea, they flipped everything backwards. Well, actually, in their story, they flipped it all backwards because they said they had been in captivity for 400 years. If we look, that's supposed to be flipping the pancake on the idea that they had ruled and took over Egypt for 400 years. So it's trying to play the victim and turn it around backwards, and instead of sticking their chest out, they're playing the victim kind of idea. That becomes a theme with these people, just like typology we've looked at all the way through it. But you look through the Bible and it repeats things over and over again. But this idea of being the victim, because then of course they had just gotten back from the Babylonian captivity. Before that they were actually just Canaanites, and by getting a 10-year flavoring on Babylonian captivity and learning all the things about that there, they were able to actually reinvent themselves as the people we know that came out of nowhere, poof, popcorn the Bible, with a story flipped around backwards. But apparently their first original god that they had going on here too was a donkey, and it actually frays over about 450 years at least worth of time. So it's not like, well, we had one, last week or last generation or a couple of generations and got rid of it. It actually encompasses a major point, the ending of the Old Testament, and then through the idea of the New Testament too, up until the point that it even gets pulled into inception and so on. So kind of strange here, this telling where it goes on. And so during that time, they took all their stuff, and this very conspicuously looks just like whenever Titus took all their stuff, and it's on the Arch of Titus and stuff that's there. But that keeps happening too. And see, the weird thing about this is that we can kind of verify this kept happening there too. So you have to go around and validate their God with all these things letting them happen to them. And of course, all they have to do is just say, well, we screwed up. We didn't worship right on last Thursday, and this happened because it. And it's, boy, your God sure is picky. He's willing to let y'all go through hell. How about no? So here's an effigy been found with a ruby set inside its eye, and it's like a little donkey god. And that's not only reminiscent of Set, but that's actually where it kind of got to come from. And whenever you look at ancient anthropomorphic statues, sure, they go back to Cro-Magnon times and things, and there are versions shown in the Sumerians. It's not like the Egyptians are the only people that have it. But the people that are strong, and strong in this story we're talking about, strong in the area of it happening and everything, are the Egyptians. And one would have to look at that and realize, just as all the ancients did around this time, which has kind of had a smoke blown over the top of it where you don't supposed to see it, is the fact that they took one of the Egyptian gods that was kind of set aside as just a yin and yang situation and not prominent, and tried to flip it around on him. And this god, at about the same time we're talking about, going from 200 BC to 200 AD and plus, actually is looked at as being chaos and something like the devil and so on. Well, we'll get to that in a minute too. So in this Holy of Holies area that you always hear about as far as having the Ark of the Covenant, Which if you look into the story of the Bible, things like that, the people came and stole all the stuff a bunch of times. Well, did they actually get it back? Well, they tell them they did. Well, did they get stuff that was in it? That was supposed to be so special, or did other people get that? Now, there's a story of a giant one time picking it up over his shoulder and just running off with it. Now, the Philistines and so on, which we find now were Europeans that came in. But in this Holy of Holies that you think of as being Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant and all those type situations that go on there, wouldn't it blow you away that instead of being a box with two angels on top, or dove people, which we can see in all the other pagan religions and what their concept is of heaven too, it's really a statue of Seth. It's been changed a little bit. It's been non-Egyptianized. Well, that's about it. I showed you the names of the Hyksos rulers when we went through this before, and there's Jacob. There's Yakub right there. Yakub-Baal. Oh, it starts to get real telling. Yakub-El. And of course, El is the god of the Canaanites and so on, and that's just right there, man. That's just right there. But when this guy comes in to this Holy of Holies, it's supposed to be empty. Apparently there's smoke and incense in there, and probably smelled like pot off what we know now today from what the incense was made of and so on, and found on these altars. But that's not saying anything bad about them. That's used for enlightenment and all kinds of things. Let's be straight about that. But then again, who's there? Well, they're doing a ceremony that you would look at, and as long as their dress was changed different, you'd say this is the Egyptian ceremony where they're putting that pipe thing up to the god, but they're doing it to Set, so they're worshiping Set, but those don't look like Egyptians. Well, for a time they were, if they were the Hyksos. Kind of strange. They were Canaanites, then they flipped and come back, try to be somebody else. The same flip came out of Egypt. Angels are a donkey. Because this Seth idea is told by a few more prominent Greeks and local and even Italians later, in Romans, if you will. And in fact, Romans, though it looks kind of funny, Set looks kind of funny, the Romans and the Greeks both agree that, no, that's a donkey. Quite often red-headed. So these stories continued too. Other than what we just shown, they continued on through a man named Poseidonus, shown here for one of his Greek statues. But it goes on from there. But he's writing around 70 BC. And Apolonius Molon, he's running about the same time, and they're both from the island of Rhodes down over here in the Aegean area. You know where Rhodes is, right? Well, Antiochus IV also finds this idea. Antiochus, just for everybody to know, this is the one with the most famous sacking of the Jerusalem temple, and he's actually the cause of the Maccabean literature and everything that comes later after that. By the way, archaeology and everything shows that in the time of King David, this thing would have been a small little place. It's nothing that big whatsoever. People look at it in a modern day and see it's that big. Just like if I was to say, well, in 1764 in New York, and you're thinking there are going to be high rises and this place is huge, but it's not in any way. There's a couple of main roads through it, and it looks like a small town USA at that point compared to what it looks like now. This looked that same way. So people all through time have mentioned this idea, and you think that there's this menorah that's in there and so on goes on, but no. This Antiochus, he's the one that talks about the abomination of desolation that comes out of that in the inner sanctum. He goes into there and he finds evidence of Yep, there it is again, of a donkey god sitting on a throne. But this time the story's a little bit different. This time the story's a little bit changed, where there's a man sitting on a donkey. Now that could change a few things, but you could also turn this into the idea that that's Moses, and that's what that is. Or this could be whenever they're back to Baal worshiping, by the way, and this is the whole story of Baalim and the talking donkey and everything. But why would that be the major thing inside of the inner sanctum? That doesn't almost make any sense either, does it? Well, this also could be the Savior. But then again, this is well before Christ or anything happening like that, but this could be one way of indication of that, how that was supposed to go and how that was supposed to happen. He's sitting there riding the thing backwards, pulling its tail. But so in that story, he finds that there's a donkey with a man riding on it that's in the inner sanctum. This is in the Holy of Holies, when they sacked this place. So there's another idea too that, it does say that the Messiah will come riding on a donkey. And in fact, that's supposedly the reason that in the New Testament they had Jesus come riding on a donkey, which in a modern day, with our knowing of horses or the fact they could have used chariots or this, that, and the other, might show you something. And he was trying to make connections that are shown in the Old Testament. If you look at it, that's really what he was trying to do. With about 2/3 of that there was make all these connections all at once, with being from Bethlehem. All of the ideas are tried to be thrown into that. This is the guy they were talking about. But he comes in riding on a donkey. So that's another thing. But also, in my series here, Written in the Stars, we also talk about there's a donkey. In fact, there's the man that kills 1,000 people with the jawbone of an ass. That's right there. Well, that's that ass. That's that donkey that's there too. There's a whole little thing that goes along with that. In fact, that sacred donkey was said long ago, somehow, that it was a magic talking donkey, and that it was the same donkey that was in the oldest of stories, and the one that took Abraham and Sarah over, the same one that led people down to Egypt, the same one that Joseph and Mary take with Jesus, and then that's that same one that takes Jesus in there. Why? Well, it's right there in the stars. It's the same one. It's the same story. In fact, I showed you how these stories are all written in an area about the size of your palm at arm's length. Here's another document. This goes with Zechariah, and it was called The Birth of Mary. And the Christian used this document, or apparently called Fibonite. So in this story, it talks about Zechariah, and it says that they should be cursed from anybody that killed from Zechariah until now, which is a strange telling of a time or whatever. But there's a Zechariah in the Bible that's there, and they talk about him having been killed out of here in this courtyard area that goes along with this. So that's something strange too. Also, this same Zechariah was said to in some way have lost his ability for speech and things like that. But before that, he was a great priest and a helper, and he was literate and talking and doing everything, and then he went dumb. So only one time per year do you actually go into this inner sanctum and this Holy of Holies, and apparently Zechariah had never been in there, and he went in. And he's trying to look through the smoke and the incense they talk about again and come into this holy altar that's there or whatever, and I guess he's expecting the Ark of Covenant, and through the dim lights and smoke that he looks through there, something gleams out. And he's described in this ancient Gnostic tale as being a man upright with a donkey head. And that it freaked him out so bad, he wanted to go tell everybody, and he wanted to run out as being a high priest. The fact that he had gotten all the way to this point and didn't even know that this was that. He wanted to go out and tell all the people, do you know what you're worshiping? You can tell why this didn't become canon in any way, can't you? Kind of strange. And I guess the one thing that can really kind of validate it is that the Jewish people have done this a few times with this flip-flop thing, and it's actually written in their literature and everything, and shows you examples of it inside of itself. So, very possible these Hyksos, whenever they got kicked out, flipped it. Well, they did. They said they had been in captivity whenever actually they were the ones that were in rule and then got kicked out. Went a little different. Was there magic involved in the parting of the Red Sea? No, that's the Sea of Reeds. That never happened the way that you think that it did either. And all the other things. Ancient Gnostics started looking at this and they were like, there's something wrong with this God. He's evil and chaotic. Well, that kind of fits the little tale here that we're talking about, doesn't it, somehow? For it even says in the Bible verse, and I used to know what it was, but yeah, I think it's Hosea, but he comes in, he says, is there not evil done in this city that is not done by Yahweh? Because he's the only one there. See, they tried to make it out like that and turn it that way in the story, but if you'll look at the story we come out of it at the end with, there's this devil creature, and apparently he's a yin and yang to him, and he's almost got as much power. Adversary. You know, you look at the tale before of the Egyptian donkey god and how that's an adversary. That's all that Satan means. The ancient word, or one of the ancient names that it calls for in the Book of the Dead, but they realize that whenever they do it, they're calling on Set for you to help take your very first boat ride and so on. And whenever they do, his name is not just Set, but it's Seta Nu, which looks like Satan with a U on the end of it, which is kind of strange, but the linguistics and everything don't fit. But then again, there's an adversary, but then he's the adversary, or yin and yang, of Horus. But he isn't the devil. Strange possible side connection. You can see Jesus over here to the right. This is whenever he comes and he talks to the Pharisees and so on, and he's rebuking them or talking about this concept. And he actually comes right out and he tells them, you're of your father the devil. Which this is one of the first times anything like that's mentioned whatsoever, or any Satan concept either, where there's this guy named Satan and he takes him up on the hill and says, look, you know, I'll give you all this stuff if you'll just turn around and worship me. Which was the concept that they wanted for the ancient Romans and stuff. Look, let's just put our statue here in there and we'll let y'all have all of this. If not, you're not going to have nothing. Well, they ended up having nothing. But whenever he tells this story too, is he making this connection where Jesus is saying, you're of the people of Seth, you're doing this thing, you flipped it around backwards, and now he's looked at as the devil, so look at you. And showing him up. Just like whenever he says, Aya, Asher, Aya, or whenever they ask him about it and they're about to stone him to death, and he says, before Abraham, I am. That's Aya. That's showing you that he probably gnostically knew about all this stuff, and the higher priest probably knew it too, and they didn't want that out. It's funny something like that gets written into the book, isn't it? Strange ideas, though. And you wonder where this God of Chaos idea comes from, too, whenever he could have done something and made it not to where Moses goes and tries to do magic tricks to get matched by the Egyptians themselves all the way to a point, and then everybody's got to go through all this hardship and everything, and frogs and God knows what else, and then causes his firstborn to die. Is this flipped around too? Because it's entirely possible one of the princes of them had a problem that's not spoken of that goes on here, And we're led to believe that he said something about, I can't stand the sound of the hippos, and it got him into a fight, and then they get kicked out. There's a lot more to it than that, and I think all of us know it. Even old philosophers came up with the idea. They said, well, is God willing to prevent evil but not able to? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cameth evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him a God? There became an age of reason and philosophy there, and like I've talked before, a lot of people don't understand why the people actually gave up all of their rich Greek Olympians and all those things going on. It's because they had a lot of morals. In their fairy tales that they made up, gods raped certain people or did something because there's only a certain number of them. So you slept with your own sister, she's a goddess and all these things, and that's where it came out. But they wouldn't want really people acting like that and so on. And through philosophy, they were to climb up that idea, and they seemed to be somewhat eager to take on something different, to take it to a new level, to not have that in their religions. You can see that reflected in the way the Bible is versus what all these pagans supposedly were. And so that's part of the reason that they decided to all of a sudden flip. People wonder why that Greeks and Romans would flip and turn around and make it all of a sudden the religion over the ones that they already had. But that's part of the major reason right there. Now let me know what you think downstairs, and let me know what you think about the donkey god here. Peace.